I take out the newspaper and I start reading about this case. It's the case of this guy named Rontarus Washington. On the front page of the paper, I kept on saying, holy shit, this guy is accused of a murder. He spent 6 years in pre-trial detention before he got a trial. He's sitting in jail for 6 years. And it's so obvious that the husband of this victim killed her. Her blood on his shirt, his hair in her dead hand. And I'm thinking to myself, how does this guy get charged with this? A black man in Kansas, where the former prosecutors were accused of all sorts of racial insensitivity, all sorts of prosecutorial misconduct. A neighbor walks into a crime scene, gets accused of the murder. All the forensic evidence points to someone else. There's no way I'm letting this go.
Lawrence, Kansas, in 2014, at Cedarwood Apartments, a notably rough apartment complex. 19-year-old Justina Mosso lived with her husband, Felipe Cantu Ruiz, on the 3rd floor. The two had a history of domestic violence, and police had been called to their residence on multiple occasions. Neighbors said they heard the couple shouting almost every day. Their fights were fueled by Felipe's excessive drinking. It was a toxic marriage filled with infidelity. Felipe was very controlling. He was constantly harassing her and spying on her. She had cheated on him multiple times. Their marriage troubles were escalating in the weeks leading up to her death. Justina had a boyfriend she was seeing on a regular basis named Fernando Martinez. She'd also had previous affairs with other men. And 1 week prior to her death, she was seen kissing an unidentified man described as tall, black, and athletic in front of Felipe's apartment. Justina even told Felipe she believed she was pregnant with another man's baby. Felipe was livid and regularly told Justina that he would never forgive her. Felipe was also unfaithful. He had been messaging with ex-girlfriends in Mexico, trying to get them to come to the United States because he was unhappy in his marriage with Justina. And just hours before Justina's death, Felipe sent a text message to a woman saying, "I am a widower." He testified, "There were ex-girlfriends I had in Mexico that were interested in coming here because I wasn't living very well with Justina. I needed to restart my life." Felipe had even started to put together the money for her to come from Mexico. In October 2014, Justina Mosso had had enough with her marriage troubles. She moved out of Cedarwood Apartments and moved in with a cousin named Olivia Flores, who lived only a couple blocks away. Despite all of this, Justina still continued her relationship with Felipe even though she had moved out. Felipe believed that Justina was coming back to him. However, he later discovered that Justina was still seeing Fernando Martinez behind his back. So how does Rontarus Washington Jr. tie into this case? Rontarus lived in the same apartment complex as Felipe and Justina. He lived down the hall from them on the 3rd floor. At the time, Rontarus was only 18 years old and had just moved to Kansas from Mississippi with his girlfriend. Like many others in the residence, Rontarus was scared to live in Cedarwood Apartments. It's a rough apartment complex that is notorious for crime. His apartment was burglarized. 2 men had kicked in his door. He was afraid of some of the people in his building. Residents frequently found strangers sleeping in the hallways and stairwells. Whenever his girlfriend would leave the apartment, Rontarus would walk her down to her ride for safety. On Halloween 2014, a few weeks after Justina had moved out, a prostitute named Marzetta Yarborough approached Cedarwood Apartments and invited both Felipe Cantu Ruiz and Rontarus Washington into Felipe's apartment for a drink. The woman began performing a sexual act on Felipe, at which point Rontarus got up to use the restroom. It is not a well-maintained building, and the toilet would not flush, so Rontarus lifted the toilet lid to manually flush it. Then Rontarus immediately left Felipe's apartment, leaving Felipe and the woman behind. The woman testified that Felipe refused to pay her that night. 1 week later, in the early morning hours of November 7th, 2014, Felipe Cantu Ruiz called Justina's cell phone, but Justina's boyfriend, Fernando Martinez, answered. Felipe became enraged and stayed up drinking until 4:30 in the morning. He sent a litany of angry messages to her. I saw you. You slept with your lover. Dick fucking whore. Fuck you, motherfucker. Stay with your fucking dude. I'm just fed up with you. I'm tired of your whoring around. I've heard myself having to forgive you time and time again. I will never forgive you for this one. Destroy yourself for being a bitch. Phone records show that Felipe only got 2 hours of sleep that night. He did not show up to work that day because he was too hungover. That afternoon of November 7th, Felipe decided to spontaneously leave town and move to Manhattan, Kansas, because he wanted a fresh start. Felipe started calling friends to request a ride out of town. Around the same time that day, Justina Mosso needed to grab some chairs from the old apartment she used to share with Felipe. She walked over twice from her cousin's house, but she returned at both times when she saw that Felipe's car was still in the parking lot. At 3 o'clock that afternoon, her cousin, Olivia Flores, arrived home from work. Justina told her cousin that Felipe was moving to Manhattan. Justina then leaves to walk back to Cedarwood Apartments for a third time, and before leaving, she tells her cousin, "If I don't come back, you come look for me." And that would be the last time that Olivia Flores would see Justina Mosso alive. Justina believed that Felipe had already left for Manhattan, but he was only at a nearby Mexican store called La Estrella. Felipe returned shortly after Justina arrived, and the two were seen having a heated argument in the parking lot. Felipe claimed that Justina tried to hit him, so he extended his arms out to keep her away. However, witnesses saw Felipe grab Justina by the shoulders and shake her. Felipe left when his friend Juan Pacheco picked him up to take him to Manhattan. He left behind the car that he and Justina shared. It is worth noting that Felipe also did not bring his toothbrush, social security card, or anything you might consider essential when moving. He didn't even tell his landlord that he was moving out. Around 4 o'clock, Felipe's neighbors arrived home and saw Justina sitting alone in Felipe's car in the Cedarwood parking lot, talking on the phone. Phone records show Justina tried to call both Felipe and Felipe's friend that gave him a ride to Manhattan. Then, roughly 25 minutes later, the same neighbor who saw Justina in the parking lot hears a haunting scream come from Felipe's apartment. Around the same time, Rontarus heard a woman scream, and then shortly after heard either 2 people or 1 large person running down the opposite stairwell on the building's south end. Then Rontarus noticed that the door to Felipe's apartment was open. He called out to see if anyone was inside, but he got no response, so he went in to check. He walked in through the open front door towards the back corner of the apartment. He saw Justina Mosso slumped over in the bathroom, laying in a pool of blood. He panicked and ran out of the apartment. Rontarus did not report this to police because he was afraid he might be blamed for the crime. Later that evening, Felipe's friend drops him off in Manhattan, Kansas, roughly 3 to 4 hours after they allegedly left Lawrence. Felipe drank heavily after arriving in Manhattan. Prior to Justina's death, Felipe would constantly check in and text her as many as 150 to 200 times a day, but he did not make any attempt to contact her after she was killed. 2 days later, on November 9th, 2014, Felipe called a man in Lawrence named Enrique Peñalosa and asked him to check to see if Felipe's Cedarwood apartment was unlocked and to check on his car. Enrique went to the apartment complex and checked the door handle and confirmed it was unlocked. But rather than call police, Enrique instead called Felipe and told him the news. Neighbors would later tell police that they heard someone walking around in Felipe's apartment that day. Felipe then asked Justina's cousin Olivia about Justina's whereabouts. Justina Mosso was then reported missing to the Lawrence Police Department by her cousin. Felipe called in a welfare check on Justina and says, "She's in there. She hurt herself. I am not guilty. I didn't do anything to her." Keep in mind, authorities haven't even discovered that she's dead yet. The police arrive and are told that the door is unlocked, and they enter ungloved. They discovered Justina Mosso stabbed 42 times and beaten over the head with a toilet lid. They found 2 of Felipe's hairs clutched in her hand. Felipe's blood was found in the bathroom sink and in the bathroom doorway. There was another blood stain found on the toilet that does not match Felipe, Justina Mosso, or Rontarus Washington Jr. None of the blood found matches Rontarus Washington Jr. The police contacted Felipe and asked him to return to Lawrence and talk with them. He is driven back by his friend No Galeana. Felipe cried on the ride back and admitted that something bad had happened to Justina and he was afraid he would be blamed. When they arrived in Lawrence, the police noted that Felipe had multiple cuts on his hand and a wound on his left palm that was still actively bleeding. Multiple neighbors noticed that Felipe's car had been moved to a different parking spot since the last day that Justina was seen alive. Felipe and Justina had purchased the car from No Galeana, the same man who drove Felipe back from Manhattan. Felipe claimed the only car key that existed was in Justina's possession. Police did not take any photos of Juan Pacheco's car that Felipe was driven to Manhattan in, and they did not conduct a full search of the car either. Police never found the murder weapon, but there was a large knife missing from Felipe's apartment, and police found discarded packaging from a lock blade knife outside the apartment complex. The coroner, Eric Mitchell, was not able to identify an exact time of death, so he made an estimation based on cell phone records. This is key because it allows a window of uncertainty where police cannot eliminate Felipe's alibi that he was on his way to Manhattan. Mitchell has been the subject of controversy in the past. Before working in Kansas, he worked in Syracuse, where an investigation was opened up after multiple men who were convicted of sex crimes had photographs of themselves taken with dead bodies in Mitchell's office. Mitchell's co-worker, Dr. William Sawyer, stated under oath that he had witnessed Mitchell slant the interpretation of evidence to serve his predetermined objectives, and he routinely offered opinions without any scientific evidence, and that Mitchell's interpretations of evidence cannot be trusted as impartial or accurate. Another coworker, Dr. David Regal, stated that Mitchell had instructed him to fashion his autopsy reports in a way that would allow for manipulation of case findings. Regal also stated that Mitchell had told him medical examiners worked for the county and were there solely to serve the needs of the district attorney's office. He also played a part in many controversial cases. In a 1987 case, Hector Rivas was accused of killing his girlfriend. Eric Mitchell originally ruled the time of death happened during a time when Rivas had an alibi. 5 years later, William Fitzpatrick was elected district attorney in Syracuse on a campaign that promised to reopen cold cases. Fitzpatrick asked Eric Mitchell to expand the time of death in the case against Rivas in order to weaken his alibi. Mitchell was under investigation at this time, but he agreed. Hector Rivas was convicted shortly after. He spent 23 years in prison. He was granted a new trial, but died in prison before it began. Mitchell was also the medical examiner in the case of Olin Pete Coons, who was convicted for a 2008 double murder. There was no physical evidence linking Coons to the crime. His daughter testified that he was at home the night of the murder. Pete Coons was released after wrongfully serving 12 years in prison. Unfortunately, he was battling health issues and passed away just 3 months after being released. Mitchell was recently included in an episode of the Netflix series Unsolved Mysteries. He was the medical examiner in the 2004 death of Alonzo Brooks. Many believe Alonzo Brooks was murdered. However, Eric Mitchell was not able to determine the cause of death, and the case was closed. After the Netflix episode aired in 2020, the case was reopened. The FBI dug up Alonzo Brooks' body and performed a new autopsy in which they ruled the death was a homicide. Mitchell was the coroner in the 1991 case against Walla Daniel, who was accused of drowning his wife. Numerous colleagues in Mitchell's office concluded the death was an accident, Some of his co-workers even publicly accused Mitchell of committing perjury for claiming the death was a murder. Walla Daniel served 26 years in prison before being released in 2018. Mitchell was also the medical examiner in the case of Floyd Bledsoe, who was convicted of a 1999 murder of a young woman. Despite the lack of physical evidence, Bledsoe was convicted and sentenced to life in prison. His brother later confessed to the murder in a suicide note in 2015. Bledsoe served 15 years in prison before being released. Back at the scene, police scanned the area and Rontarus willingly met with them. They noted that Rontarus did not appear nervous or uncomfortable, and he did not have any visible injuries. Rontarus was hesitant to tell the police about the time he entered the apartment and drank with Felipe and the prostitute because he was afraid he would get in trouble for drinking underage. The police told Rontarus that he was their best witness so far, and he eventually told them about the night that he drank in the apartment, as well as how he walked in on Justina's body and ran out because he was scared. He agreed to give his DNA samples to police. After police learned that Rontarus had entered the apartment, they locked in on the idea that this was a burglary gone wrong. They searched Rontarus' apartment and found a blood stain on the bottom of his shoe, which he admitted to in the interview. It is worth noting that there was no blood found on the top of his shoe or any of his clothes, or anywhere else in his apartment. This is interesting because if somebody is stabbed 42 times, there's going to be blood splatter. This detail actually corroborates the story that Rontarus told that he walked in on the crime scene. They also matched his fingerprint on the toilet lid, along with multiple other unidentified fingerprints. The prints were consistent with lifting a toilet lid to try and flush it. The police did not check to see if the toilet was functioning. There were multiple unidentified shoe prints found at the scene, but police said they didn't have any clues to try to match them with. This detail is interesting because it might corroborate the theory that Rontarus posed to detectives that there was more than one attacker involved in this killing. The police did not collect the shoes Felipe took with him to Manhattan or the sandals he left in Juan Pacheco's car. When Justina's body was discovered, her phone and purse were gone. Her purse was never found. Her phone was later discovered on the roof of Cedarwood Apartments. There was evidence that someone had deleted the messages off of her phone. The phone was wrapped in a sock. Police originally believed that the sock belonged to Rontarus, but that was later disproven. Rontarus' DNA was not found on the cell phone. Without a murder weapon, the police used Rontarus' toilet lid fingerprint and shoe print to tie him to the scene of the crime. The police then arrested Rontarus Washington for the murder of Justina Mosso. However, Justina Mosso's family told an attorney that the police arrested the wrong person and that Felipe Cantu Ruiz was the real killer. This information was never handed over to Rontarus' defense team before trial, a violation of his constitutional rights. The case finally went to trial in 2019 after Rontarus had been sitting in jail for over 5 years. At court, Officer Garcia, who had been translating throughout much of the police investigation, took several of the Spanish-speaking witnesses into a room for a private meeting. Afterwards, they were no longer willing to testify. The jury deliberated, but unfortunately was unable to reach a verdict. Despite the hung jury, the court decided that Rontarus was not free. He would still be held in jail with a bond of nearly $1 million. In the summer of 2020, while the country was coping with the murder of George Floyd, unrest grew in Lawrence after a mural of George Floyd with a noose around his neck suddenly showed up in a park near downtown. People protested for days and demanded for the mural to be taken down. The message of the protest quickly shifted toward justice for Rontarus. The main street downtown was painted with a giant Free Rontarus mural.
An unsettling depiction of George Floyd found in this park next to police headquarters drew these crowds of protesters on Saturday. Since then, their presence on Mass Street has drawn attention to a case of a local man behind bars for 5 years.
I'm here for Rontarus Washington Jr. And The fact that he sat in jail 5.5 years without a trial.
Over the weekend, protesters on Mass Street seeking racial justice called for the judge to reduce Washington's bond ahead of his second trial.
They demand three things: an investigation of a racist banner found in South Park. They're asking for the immediate release of Rontarus Washington. He's been jailed for 5 years awaiting a Lawrence murder trial.
Your hands are tied. You don't have the power. The city commissioners don't have the power. The police don't have the power. Then who does? That's the system. That's when you hit against system. But you can do something. You can do something tomorrow. You can do something tonight. You can text somebody. You can call somebody. You can write somebody. You can research something. So whatever you have to do to get this going. He has been in jail for over 5 years without a trial. And that's more than enough time. That's more than enough punishment for something that he didn't do. It's not that we want to compromise. We want actual justice for him. Yes.
We are at a pivotal point in the history of our nation, and Lawrence, Kansas is no exception to that. The injustices may seem small scale, insignificant to some, but let me assure you, they are not. Ripping away 6 years of someone's life is significant. Ripping away a father from his children, from his mother, from his sisters, is significant. Rontarus Washington Jr. was in a cell for 6 years of his life. Rontarus deserves to be treated as significant.
The judge eventually agreed to drop it to $500,000 with a 10% surety. Strangers showed support for Washington on GoFundMe as some in Lawrence put up their homes and businesses as collateral.
Tonight, a man who was in jail for more than 5 years after a hung jury murder trial has been released on bond. Rontarus Washington Jr. left the Douglas County Jail today after family and friends raised enough money for his bail through GoFundMe. Protesters in Lawrence have been marching for days demanding his release.
Moments that loved ones and supporters of Rontarus Washington Jr. didn't think would come soon enough.
It brought awareness. You know, this has been going on for 5 years, and I'm just speechless.
Washington made it a point to stop by Mass Street with his family to say thanks in person.
Rontarus was officially bonded out on bail on July 1st, 2020, roughly 6 years after he was arrested.
The fight is not over, but this is a victory. We will not stand for injustice. He is innocent.
We will demand no other human being be treated in the way that Rontarus was treated.
We're just gonna have to keep praying, stick together, and just help him get through it.
Despite being out of jail on bond, Rontarus Washington was still fighting for his freedom. District Attorney Charles Branson's office was still insisting on holding another trial against him. In August 2020, prosecutor C.J. Reig withdrew from the case, having revealed her racial bias by telling the defense the only reason Mr. Washington was not convicted at the jury trial was because a black juror refused to convict a black defendant. She was replaced by Deputy Attorney David Melton. Melton was the same attorney who was informed in 2015 by another attorney representing Justina Mosso's family that Felipe Cantu Ruiz was the real killer. Melton did not pass this on to law enforcement and did not think it was a conflict of interest to join the prosecution. Election season was heating up, and longtime District Attorney Charles Branson would face his first challengers since taking office in 2004. Branson had been criticized for his handling of many cases, including Rontarus Washington Jr.'s. The candidates running against him were Suzanne Valdez and Cooper Overstreet. Social justice was a central topic of discussion all around the country, and Lawrence, Kansas was no exception. The case against Rontarus Washington Jr. had become a talking point around town. Cooper Overstreet was an attorney at the law firm that originally represented Rontarus during the first few months of the case. During the campaign for DA, he was vocal about how he would dismiss the charges against Rontarus if elected. Suzanne Valdez ran on a platform that highlighted the need to bring change and accountability to the district attorney's office. Recognizing the strong public outcry around the Rontarus Washington case and a political opportunity to simultaneously criticize both of her opponents, she became a vocal critic of Charles Branson and Cooper Overstreet's handling of the case.
And we need to think about all of the injustice that our Black communities have faced, and we need to do everything we can to fix it.
I really want to ensure that the justice system works for victims and doesn't create new victims through the justice system.
Suzanne's treasurer, Josh Seiden, released a letter detailing why Suzanne Valdez would make a better DA and listed the case against Rontarus Washington Jr. as one of the reasons. Strangely enough, one of the endorsements on Suzanne Valdez's website was from Enrique Peñalosa, the same man who Felipe called to check on his Cedarwood apartment before Justina was officially reported missing. The same man who later admitted to touching the doorknob at the murder scene before police arrived on site. The only one on record who had complete access to the scene and the opportunity to tamper with evidence. Suzanne Valdez wins the election, ousting longtime DA Charles Branson. Lawrence elected a new district attorney for the first time since 2004. Valdez officially takes office in January 2021. Her treasurer, Josh Seiden, is promoted to deputy district attorney. "I'm the forest and he's the trees," she said, while noting that Seiden focuses on the details while she takes a more global approach. Calls began to grow from local activists demanding that she take action on behalf of Rontarus Washington, after exploiting his case throughout the campaign trail. On February 12th, she released a statement. "I could not, nor have I ever, commented on the merits of the State v. Washington case. Importantly, I have never promised to dismiss the case against Mr. Washington." She indicated that her concerns were with how long the process was taking, not with whether or not the right person was being tried for the crime. Rontarus Washington's attorneys, Angela Keck and Adam Hall, filed a motion to dismiss the case, citing multiple reasons, one of which centered around the alternative suspect, Justina Mosso's ex-husband, Felipe Cantu Ruiz. On November 27, 2014, just a few weeks after Justina Mosso's murder, Felipe Cantu Ruiz was arrested for his third DUI. He was sentenced to probation in May 2016, 2 months after being sentenced. Then, District Attorney Charles Branson signed documents to help get Felipe Cantu Ruiz a U visa, allowing him to stay in the country, citing that Felipe had been cooperative with the police throughout the investigation and for testifying against Rontarus Washington. In June 2017, Felipe Cantu Ruiz's probation officer alleged that Cantu Ruiz violated the probation by failing to complete alcohol assessment and treatment, failing to pay $2,904 in fines and costs, and failure to appear in court. Washington's attorneys allege that Felipe also violated his probation by leaving the state without permission. Suzanne Valdez told the judge to hold off before ruling on the motion to dismiss because she discovered an alleged sex crime involving Felipe Cantu Ruiz from March 20th, 2017 that was never charged by Charles Branson. The woman involved in the incident told police that Felipe Cantu Ruiz was drunk in their home and sexually assaulted her. Felipe attempted to kiss the woman and put his hands up her dress despite her multiple pleas for him to stop. The woman called out to wake up her husband, and a scuffle ensued between the three of them. She was struck in the nose during the altercation, causing her face to bleed. Felipe left the scene before police arrived, and they were never able to locate him that night. This all happened while Felipe was on probation. Despite having violated multiple terms of his probation agreement and his active refusal to appear in court until his arrest in Illinois, prosecutor Alice Walker requested that the court ignore his numerous transgressions and release him from his probation. This all occurred roughly 4 months prior to the trial in which Felipe would testify on behalf of the prosecution. Suzanne Valdez sent the police report to an outside agency to review for charging considerations. In May 2021, the Franklin County District Attorney's Office announced that they would not be charging Felipe Cantu Ruiz for the sex crimes because they did not feel there was enough evidence that crime was committed. It is unclear whether Suzanne Valdez informed the district attorney of Franklin County of Felipe's history of domestic violence, probationary status at the time, or the favorable legal and immigration treatment he had been receiving. Prosecutor Alice Walker withdrew from the case, and she was replaced by Suzanne Valdez's right-hand man, Josh Seiden. On a positive note, the Innocence Project announced it was taking over the case and would serve as Rontarus Washington's new defense attorneys. Still, one has to wonder why Felipe Cantu Ruiz has been given such lenient treatment from the law, even as he continues to intimidate witnesses and threaten anyone who talks about this case. Felipe Cantu Ruiz never even attended Justina Mosso's funeral. And as we come up on the 7-year anniversary of her death, we have to wonder, will she ever get the justice she deserves?